Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this afternoon to speak on S-2943, which is the National Defense Authorization Act that we recently invoked cloture on the motion to proceed. I guess we are going to be on this bill, and I'm glad we are. In particular, I want to address Section 578 of this act. Section 578 is simply designed to protect our service members' children when they're at school, specifically to protect them from convicted pedophiles and other dangerous felons who try to infiltrate our nation's schools when they can to find more victims. This is a cause I've been working on, well, for at least 2.5 years here in the Senate, Mr. President. We have a serious problem, and we've made some progress, but we've got a long way to go. For me, this campaign, this effort to address this began with a terrible, terrible story of a child named Jeremy Bell. And the story begins in my home state of Pennsylvania, in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. A school teacher had molested several boys. He had raped one of them. The officials at the school figured out that something was gone wrong here. Prosecutors were brought in, but they never felt like they had enough evidence to actually press charges, to bring a case. The school decided that they would dismiss this teacher. They didn't want him around anymore, but shockingly and appallingly, they decided that to facilitate his departure from the school, they would help him get a job in another school. They'd actually recommend him for hire somewhere else. Well, he did get a job in another school in West Virginia with the help in part of the letter of recommendation he got from the Delaware County School District. And that teacher went on to become a school principal. And of course, he continued his appalling victimization of children. And it ended when he raped and murdered a 12-year-old boy named Jeremy Bell. Well, justice eventually caught up with that monster who had gone from Pennsylvania to West Virginia. He's now in jail, where I hope he will remain for the rest of his life. But for Jeremy Bell, of course, that justice came too late. And sadly, Mr. President, Jeremy Bell is not alone. Year after year, we see staggering and heartbreaking numbers. 2014, at least 459 teachers and other professional school workers across the country were arrested for sexual misconduct with the kids they're supposed to be taking care of. That's more than one per day. In 2015, the number went up. It got worse. It was 496 arrests. Again, school teachers and school personnel who have unsupervised contact with these children. And so far, 2016 is not doing any better. We've had 185 arrests in just 144 days. So, you know, one way to look at this, Mr. President, is just since I got engaged in this battle 2.5 years ago, we've had at least 1,140 school employees arrested for sexual misconduct with the children in their care. And of course, these are just the ones that have been caught. These are the ones we know about. These are the ones where there's enough information and evidence that the law enforcement folks were comfortable in making an arrest. How many more? How much is this going on? And of course, every one of these stories is a terrible, terrible tragedy for the victims. Like the child whose sexual abuse began at age 10 and only ended when at 17 she found she was pregnant with the teacher's child. Or the teacher's aide who raped a young mentally disabled boy who was in his care. These are hard things to even talk about, Mr. President. But think of how infinitely harder it is for the victims to suffer through this. And the examples go on and on. This has to stop. We have to be doing everything we can to try to prevent this and to protect the kids that are in our country's schools. This is why back in 2013 I introduced a bill that was meant to do exactly that. It was called the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. It's a bipartisan bill, and it included fundamentally two protections. The first was a ban on this terrible practice that led to the murder of Jeremy Bell. It holds that a school would have to be forbidden from knowingly recommending for hire someone who was a known child molester. It seems like so appalling, how could this happen? But the Jeremy Bell case is not the only case. In fact, this phenomenon by which schools try to get rid of their monsters by making him someone else's problem, it is so widely recognized that schools will facilitate that person getting a job somewhere else. This phenomenon has its own name. It's called passing the trash. And our people who are advocates for crime victims, people who help children to cope with a horrendous experience that they've been through, they know this very well. They know this phenomenon because they've seen it all too often. So that's the first piece of my legislation from 2013, make it illegal to knowingly pass the trash. And the second is to just require a thorough background check, a thorough criminal background check, whenever someone is being hired who will have unsupervised contact with children in a school. So that means teachers, but it also means coaches. It means the school bus driver. It means contractors, if the contractor will have that kind of access to the children. Now, last December, Mr. President, we had an important victory on this because the first protection, the prohibition against knowingly passing the trash, that passed the Senate. It was a battle. There were people here who fought this very aggressively, but eventually I was able to get a vote on the Senate floor, and it passed overwhelmingly. It was then included in the text of the Every Student Succeeds Act. That legislation has since been signed into law. So it is now the law of the land that it is forbidden to knowingly recommend these pedophiles for hire. But as I said, that was only the first part of our legislation. That success we had back in December was only a first step, and we were not able to succeed with the tougher, more comprehensive background checks that we need. And so I said at the time, I'm not finished. We're going to continue this fight, and we are. And that's why I'm here today, because the legislation that we're about to take up, the National Defense Authorization Act, takes us another important step forward. And what it does is helps in this effort to have more comprehensive background checks. You know, I've got a personal interest in this, Mr. President, and that is that I have 3 young children, a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And I represent 12.8 million Pennsylvanians. And the vast majority of the people that I represent have the exact same view that I do, which is when we put our kids on the bus in the morning to go to school, we have every right to believe that we're sending our child to the safest possible environment. So that's what this is about. What this legislation does in the Defense Authorization Bill is it incorporates a bill that I introduced earlier this year, and that bill was called the Protecting Service Members' Children Act. The National Defense Authorization Bill takes my bill, this Protecting Service Members' Children's Act, and incorporates it, builds it in. And what it does is it covers DOD, Defense Department operated schools in the U.S., of which there are many, but it also covers schools in school districts that receive federal impact aid because the children of our military folks attend those schools. So that is one of the ways that we cover some of the cost of educating our men and women in uniform, their kids. We do it by providing this impact aid to the school districts to which they send their kids. And what my legislation does and what the NDAA therefore does is it requires these schools to conduct the same kind of background check that the DOD requires of its own schools, which is exactly the right thing to do. And that provides also that if a person has been convicted of certain serious crimes, and that would include violent or sexual crimes against a child, then that criminal may not be employed in a position that gives him unsupervised access to children. It's as simple as that. This will cover schools that serve about 17% of our school children. That's roughly 8.5 million kids. And Mr. President, I think this is just common sense. A background check for school workers is simply common sense. All states, all school districts do this to some degree. The problem is not everyone does it to an adequate degree. And my view is that it should not be possible for a person who's been convicted of child rape to walk out of a prison, walk down the street, and get a job in an elementary school. I mean, that should be absolutely impossible. I'm not suggesting that that convict shouldn't be able to get any job, but I absolutely am suggesting that he should not be able to get a job in which he has unsupervised contact with children. That, to me, is a no-brainer. This feature, my bill, the legislation, does not impose any new burdens on the Department of Defense. The DoD regulation, as I said, already requires this thorough background check on all DoD-operated schools. But what we do is we reaffirm that so that no future administration could water that down by executive order or some other way. I would also suggest, Mr. President, that there's an important reason why it's absolutely essential we provide this protection to the members of our military, and that is that the men and women who put on the uniform of this country don't always have a say in where they're going to be stationed. They don't necessarily get to decide which base in which state they're going to work, and therefore which school their children will attend. So when they get moved to another state over which they have no say, they certainly have no say in the background check policy of that school or that school district or that state. And so here they are, these men and women who take enormous personal risks and make huge sacrifices to protect us. It seems to me the least we can be doing is protecting their kids when their kids are going to school. I should salute the efforts of State Senator Tony Williams from Pennsylvania, because the fact is the children of Pennsylvania, in Pennsylvania, are protected by a very rigorous background check system, thanks largely to Senator Williams' insistence that we do this and his advocacy for legislation that gets that done. But you know, when Pennsylvania service members are stationed in some other state, they still deserve the same level of protection that they get in Pennsylvania. But Tony Williams' bill, that is now the law of the land in Pennsylvania, well, it doesn't apply beyond the borders of Pennsylvania. And that's why we need this legislation, to make sure that all the men and women who wear the uniform of this country can know that their children will have this protection. I just think it is the least, really, truly, the least we can do for the people who are ensuring the safety and security of all of us in our country is to make sure that their children are at least safe from convicted pedophiles and other dangerous felons who attempt to infiltrate these schools. Let me also thank someone else. I want to thank the chairman. Senator McCain has been an ally of mine in this ongoing battle to keep our kids safer for years now. His leadership has been outstanding, and it's because of his commitment to the safety and security of our kids that my legislation is in the National Defense Authorization Act, the legislation that we're considering today. Senator McCain was a co-sponsor of my first bill to protect kids in the classroom, and his support was essential in the victory we had last year when we were able to prohibit passing the trash. And it is absolutely the case that without his steadfast support, we would not have this provision in this legislation today. So I am very grateful to Senator McCain for his leadership on this, and I'm just proud to be standing with him in this important issue. Let me just close with this, Mr. President. The fact is, it is past time to act. It is past time to do something about this. In the 2.5 years since I have been trying to make sure that we stop permitting schools to pass the trash, in the 2.5 years since I've been trying to get the most rigorous standards for doing background checks, during that time alone, there have been over 1,100 school employees arrested. And as I say, those are the ones we know about. How much bigger does this number have to get? How much longer do we have to wait? More importantly, how many kids have to be brutalized? How many kids have to have their childhood shattered before we're going to impose the toughest possible regimen to protect these kids? I've seen way more than enough. The families who've been torn apart by this devastating crimes, they've seen way too much. So I urge my colleagues today, let's get this done. Let's get this done. Let's take a big step forward in providing a significant additional level of security and protection for the children of the men and women who sacrifice so much to protect all of us. And I yield the floor.